Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. I want to welcome back to the program Eoin Higgins, reporter at IT Brew, author of Owned, How Tech Billionaires on the Right Bought the Loudest Voices on the Left. And let me apologize right up front. I've got the hiccups. I'm not going to be able to pretend like I don't.
You were pretty good for the first half hour.
I didn't have them the first half hour.
They're back. It must have been David Dayen upsetting you so much, and we'll be upset, I think, with this conversation as well.
Yeah. Let's. Oh, wait. Where do I have my notes here? Your book is basically you're doing two things. There are two stories basically that you're tracking. One is sort of the rise of the tech bro culture, and which now, I mean, 2 years, 3 years after you start writing the book, maybe more, we're seeing is basically running the country, these guys, and the parallel sort of turning to, I'd rather have you describe what you would consider this turn of two sort of very, very prominent left of center writers, Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, both formerly friends of mine. I mean, Glenn, I think I was the first person to give him mass national interview on Air America back when he was Unclaimed Territory, which you start your book off with. But give us this, how would you describe them and their trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I start the book, with WikiLeaks and talking about Glenn. I start talking primarily about Glenn and his position within the liberal blogosphere, which is the same, time period that you're talking about here, and how that's when, when I discovered him, when a lot of my peers discovered him, when he was pushing back against the excesses of the so-called war on terror and the Bush administration's civil liberties violations in general. And then, I followed him throughout the Obama years, where he presented a really good pushback on the way that the Democratic administration was doing the same thing. And a lot of Democrats and liberal allies in media were not pushing back against them in the same way. I think that led to a lot of frustration. As far as, this was who Glenn was. He exposed the Snowden files. That was massive reporting, earth-shaking reporting. And Matt was I think also a really important voice, someone who was able to break down the complexities of the financial crisis and that period of time for an audience that needed, I think, someone to kind of take the fight to these interests and to push back. And so that's kind of the context for these guys and their evolution. I call them the loudest voices of the left in the book title, but I think they're kind of nominally left. They were left aligned. I think that they probably had more of a left audience. That's kind of like a shorthand. So I just use that as a way of kind of explaining like where they were coming from, and where they're at now is I would say much different.
I mean, it was interesting for people coming out of that era, and by that era I mean like in the run up to the Bush second Bush election, and just after that when the blogosphere was at its sort of like peak. If I remember correctly, Taibbi was not part of the blogosphere, as it were. He was writing for Rolling Stone, but Glenn was very much of that. At one point, he had with Heather Parton Digby and with John Amato for Crooks and Liars, they had started actually a sort of I don't know if it was a PAC or something to promote Democratic candidates. Glenn was very much of the blogosphere. Taibbi was always sort of like a contrarian, particularly in like 04, and sort of he's a guy who modeled himself after his name escapes me now.
Hunter S. Thompson.
Yes.
Oh,
Thompson.
yeah.
So there was a certain and I like the fact that you sort of like point out that they're both Gen Xers. Taibbi, Hunter S. Thompson, and also, God, what was that guy's name now? Darn it. I can't remember the writer, but there was an attitude, which like a sarcasm that Taibbi came out of. No, it was
PJ O'Rourke, maybe.
PJ O'Rourke, exactly.
And
And so they both had they both came from different places. Glenn, in that era, it was very easy when everyone was opposed to Bush to not see differences in ideology. I mean, just as an example, I remember talking to Jonathan Alter in a green room at MSNBC during when Obama was elected, and he's talking about cutting Social Security. I'm like, you wrote the book on FDR. What are you talking about? And you start to see those things in those instances. I mean, so part of it was that, right, in terms of their ideological center.
Yeah, I think, Taibbi did work for Rolling Stone, although I think that he does have some alternative media credibility here, right? Like he did start the exile in Russia. He came back to the U.S. to start another publication. He covered the election for, I believe, for the New York Observer, which I guess is not like alternative media, but it's not big media. And he talks about how the press on the plane, like there was like a almost like a cliquey hierarchy during the campaign, expressing some frustration about that, which I think is really understandable. And Glenn was definitely more in the liberal blogosphere. If you look back on the way that I think that if you were paying attention to that stuff, like a lot of my writing kind of still, I think, tends to this a little bit, especially if I'm writing like on my newsletter, where you're kind of referring to other things that other people have written and they refer back to you. And it's this kind of like, this kind of churn that I think, sometimes you'll have that on like Substack newsletters, like more independent stuff. But, these guys both came from that. Glenn was certainly friendly with a lot of the people that he criticizes now. I can't remember if I quote it in the book or not, but I remember him, referring to the great Charlie Pierce, the Esquire writer. Certainly they're not friendly anymore. He was very friendly with Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes. They're not friendly anymore, friendly with you. This was just a really like a different time. And during the Obama administration, the way that a lot of liberal allies of the Democrats in the media who Glenn had written alongside when they were opposed to Bush started to support this stuff, as I said. And I think that was very frustrating for me, certainly. So I know that it was frustrating for him because he talks about it in the book. Talks about Maddow specifically, how she kind of went more toward, I guess, the center, like the mainstream, you could call it the deep state or whatever, like this kind of national security Democrat liberal thing. And while he feels still that he maintained his principled opposition to surveillance and the excesses of the war on terror. So I think you have to kind of contextualize both of them in that moment, and everything that kind of came after that, I think is massively affected by that moment and that feeling of betrayal.
And they really, the interesting thing is they started in very different places. Like, in 2008, but you wouldn't talk of Taibbi and Greenwald in the same breath. They were just completely different animals. And Glenn's turn, it seems to me, was, and he without a doubt, I distinctly remember that era where he was alienated on some level by sort of like your typical liberal writers, but there was still a lot of sort of like, for lack of a better term, blog support of him, and the idea of being anti-establishment and the idea of putting sort of like a skepticism of national security apparatus at the front. But it was interesting because from my perspective, and the stuff about Maddow is very revealing, because Maddow did not change. I will say this, and I don't say that as a compliment. I want to make that clear. Like that, what changed was Glenn's access to that platform. And my sense is that he was already ideologically in a place where the dispositional way in which he wrote just became, from my estimation, a more of a personal issue than a change in his ideological stance. I mean, now we're much further from that, and he's much more of a hack, I think. But the Maddow thing is fascinating to me because I watched that in real time, and I was never sympathetic with Maddow. You know, I don't want to get too revealing, but I've you know, people know that about me. I've never been on her show. The last time we ever, you know, talked to each other was actually on an Air America show. And that, it seemed to me to be the sort of turning point. With Taibbi, it was also sort of more of a personal one. Like, talk about those two moments when there was a switch, because that's when they start to be converged and talked about in the same way.
Yeah. Well, I think those, okay, I guess I'll start with Maddow and Glenn's lack of access to MSNBC. I mean, this is a reality. This is what happened. The book, like the first draft of the book, had a much more lengthy discussion of this, but it was kind of, it got a little tedious. But basically, during Glenn's time at Salon, he would get on to MSNBC rather frequently. And if he was going to be on there, or in the wake of him being on there, he would write about the programs and write about the people on there rather favorably. And if it had been a little while since he had been on there, the writing turned a little more critical. You can find this with him and Fox News too. I did a whole study of this for my blog back in 2021, where I graphed out his support for his tweets in support of and in opposition to Fox News in relation to it having him on. And it's just like, the positive ones just go whoop once he's on, and the negative ones just disappear, right? And so the kind of a similar kind of thing happened with his writing in Salon and MSNBC. So I do agree that there is an aspect of that is real. And obviously, when Maddow was saying this stuff and kind of being more supportive of Obama, but was still having him on her show, he was blurbing her book and, you know, still being more friendly to her because there was that question of access, right? So I definitely agree with that. I think that's definitely true. But as those appearances dried up and I think around 2016 is really when this stuff really kicks off, when both Matt and Glenn are extremely critical of Russiagate and the way that the Democrats kind of seized onto that as a one-size-fits-all explainer for why they lost. And Taibbi talks about that. I believe he says it in Hate Inc., but he's written about it a number of times. Like the last time that he appeared on MSNBC was December 2016. He criticized their focus on Russia, and they never had him back on. Greenwald, I believe, hadn't been on there for a little while, like since then. But you know, he was also kind of boxed out. And for both of them, I think they started to resent their lack of access, also to resent the hyper focus on Russia, which I do believe that is a principled opposition that they had to that at the time. And then, you know, you get to September 2017, I believe it's the Eric Garner book comes out, and Taibbi is ready to go. He's ready to promote it, and MeToo hits, and his writings from the exile come up, and he can't like dodge out of it or wriggle away from it, and he's basically canceled. The book fails, and pretty much after that, or I wouldn't say the book fails, but the book tour fails certainly. And after that, he just kind of starts tilting to the right because the right audience is the one who didn't reject him.
Let me just one correction. It was not the Writings from the Exile. It was a book that he co-wrote with Mark Ames that they alternated chapters, and all of the writing that supposedly outlined their behavior towards women in their office at the exile was written by Ames. And I should also just add, no woman in that office, and I believe all of them are on record, actually made an accusation or even confirmed that the things that Ames wrote supposedly happened because it was more Ames like supposedly being satirical. Now, so, from my perspective, Taibbi should have gotten out in front of this before he did, and he didn't for whatever reason. But I think that MeToo accusation was unfair because there was literally no accuser. It was just Ames having written stuff that, I think Taibbi's writing sometimes can, be considered sexist and misogynist at times. People can make that assessment there on their own. But in terms of this specific thing, I feel like it's necessary to add that. But I also do feel like that was a major turning point.
Yeah, if I can just interject just to add to that, one of the things that got Taibbi in trouble at that time was, I can't remember who it was, but at the Washington Post, this woman who had an interaction with him wrote about the way that he had written about her in very attacking sexist language. So that was kind of adding to it. He did claim that Ames wrote those chapters, and as you say, nobody from that office has ever complained about it. Walker Bragman did an investigation about this for Pace magazine that I quote in the book, where just to be clear, in the book I give total total context on this. The accusations not only didn't have any kind of backup other than what they had written, but also they were spread by Mike Cernovich and this guy named Jim Goad, who is another right-wing operative. So you have to understand the entire cynicism behind deploying this to attack Taibbi. I think that's very important to understand that 100%. I do think though that, like you say, he could have and should have gotten out in front of this, and he should have dealt with this in some way, but he decided not to, and the consequences were pretty tough for him. I think he had to cancel a bunch of tour dates. And
yeah, I mean, it really undermined that book, and I think it fundamentally changed his career. But then this is the part which also gets sort of interesting and begins to sort of put them in a similar class, if you will. And that is both the rise of things like Substack and alternative, the idea that you could be a brand in and of yourself. And unlike the blogosphere days, there was a new model that happens, Patreon, and these were ideas that were floating around. I remember in the aughts, there was an essay going around saying artists now through the internet, all you need is 1,000 fans who are willing to give you $100 a year, and then you could do your art. And it ended up being a new model for journalism that the techno bros, as we now know them, sort of rushed in to fill. And so talk about this nexus, because this is really fascinating. This is really where we are today in many respects. Yeah.
So Patreon, I think, was probably the first real successful model here, but Substack really took this idea and ran with it. Started a newsletter service with a great kind of user experience. I compare it to Medium a lot, which if you're a writer, back when that came out, it was a really going from Blogspot to Medium was really like two different worlds. It was very easy to use. It looked really nice, really smooth UX. So that was kind of the Substack model, and they had payments. Matt was actually a very early adopter of it. I was an early adopter of it, but I think Matt was one of the first. And I didn't use mine for forever. He wrote Hate Inc. on Substack because that was kind of the loophole in his Rolling Stone contract that he could do that. So he had already established himself there, and then decided to move there full time. Glenn also decided to move there full time. Both of these guys, were not paid to come on, but they definitely benefited from the expanded reach that they got from a newsletter service that had.
How do you know that?
How do I know that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know.
How do you know that they didn't get paid?
Yeah, I know. Well, I know that Glenn did not, because he told me that he did not when I talked to him after he left The Intercept. Matt, I guess I just assumed that he didn't. I mean, he wrote the book on there. he started writing on there, I believe, after the investment and the paid deals started coming out. I suppose that it's possible that he did get paid to go there, but I think that his audience is already so large that he didn't need to. Plus, if you went there on a paid deal, I mean, people were making this calculation, right? Like when Glenn went there was a calculation to make. Are you going to take the money and have them take a full year of your possible income, right? Which is like, Substack could lose doing this, but they could also win doing this.
Yeah.
Or are you just going to chance it? I think somebody with Glenn's platform and somebody with Matt's platform would probably chance it. Somebody like Matt Iglesias could have chanced it too. He decided to take the money and ended up, I think, losing a couple $100,000 because of that. So it was a risk to take, but some people did take the risk. And my understanding is that Matt did. My understanding is that Glenn did, and my understanding also is that Matt did. Although I'm not 100% sure about Matt. But the paid deals that they started to hand out, I mean, these were helped along because they had the increased investment and the increased funding from Andreessen Horowitz, Mark Andreessen. And I wrote about this in 2021 for the first time, and this essay that I wrote for Business Insider is kind of, in a lot of ways, like the backbone of the thesis of the book, which is basically that these Silicon Valley guys have gotten so sick of media challenging them and criticizing them that they would rather decentralize and depower it by basically creating an alternative media ecosystem, like an alternative right-wing leaning ecosystem, media ecosystem that can basically take institutional media figures and move them over to these decentralized alternative media places and damage the institutions by not having those. Do the whole move fast and break things that Silicon Valley always talks about doing, but you do it in such a way that it kind of has the net effect of helping them out.
Well, it's bespoke media, right? In the sense that you can pick the kind of, at least in this libertarian vision, which I think is increasingly relevant as we see Elon Musk's attempt to essentially take over the government and the rise of Mark Andreessen and his influence within Meta, along with Zuckerberg, going on Joe Rogan and saying the exact same thing that Zuckerberg said months later, and he's a board member. Like, these folks are controlling our channels of communication and also have the vision that you describe, where I think perhaps I would love to get into Bari Weiss in a bit because she's an interesting figure in this as well. But there is now, like, it becomes clear that they're just libertarians, right? That, like, perhaps Glenn and Taibbi, and maybe Taibbi wasn't always this way because I loved his writing in the past, but that their vision of rights is not one that is like leftist. It's one that is like based in individualized freedom. And that fits much more neatly in a kind of like what a billionaire would want to promote versus a leftist vision that wants to tax them to give us all healthcare or something.
Yeah, I would want to make a distinction, though, between the politics of Silicon Valley and the politics, perhaps, of Glenn and Matt. Silicon Valley may describe themselves or may have described themselves in the past, these guys, as libertarians, but they've made billions and billions. They've made their fortunes on huge government contracts. So it's a very selective libertarianism.
Well, to be fair, I mean, that's when we talk about the original neoliberals, coming out of Mont Pelerin, that's what they were talking about. Right. I mean, that is that government will function as a spigot for a very specific set of individuals in our society. And, if we carry through this and through like the sort of the Curtis Yarvinism that is animating these guys now, that vision is somewhat consistent as we head into what we have under this Trump administration.
Yeah, that's exactly what Musk is doing right now. I mean, I would argue that Musk, and I'm not trying to get too far afield of your question here, Emma, but just to say that I think that what Musk is doing right now, depowering these different regulatory agencies, these different parts of the federal government, it feels to me that you can kind of trace this stuff back to this was annoying me or this was affecting my ability to make money.
Yep.
Like the FAA, you know, do they have something? You know, do they have something to do with his rockets, or like does that help like his plane get tracked? Is that what's going on here? Like I don't like Musk is a very reactive person, so I don't know how much he's really thinking about this stuff before he's just kind of doing it to try and smash USAID, USAID. You know, I saw this interesting thing by I can't remember who was like but somebody wrote that because it had something to do with the end of apartheid in South Africa, perhaps that's why he was mad. But Davis
he also had an issue with Lever. I think the Lever reported on something to this effect just yesterday.
Yeah. So you know, shut that down because they are you know, trying to regulate him or bother him in some way, or he sees it that way. CDC. I mean, I think if you look at his reaction to COVID and his anger over the fact that people weren't working and weren't back in the workplace, and that taxes were going to, you know, providing like life-saving money so that people could like stay home and like we could like manage the pandemic, right? Like that's another huge part of it. I mean, that's I think why CDC is down, although, you know, obviously there's also Trump's issue with it as well. He probably blames CDC in some ways for losing the election in 2020. But all this stuff, like none of it really seems like it's being done with like this libertarian mindset. It's more just being done to smash my enemies, but I still want all of the money to keep coming. I mean, like, who do you think is going to be benefiting from this push to criminalize and deport and house and put into concentration camps migrants, right? Like, who's going to benefit from like that kind of surveillance architecture and to set up all of like the tech stuff? Like, that's going to be Musk and his
Thiel,
allies,
right.
Thiel, like all like Palantir, like all of this stuff. So, I mean, I don't want to be like too much of a vulgar materialist here, but that is kind of the way that I see this stuff. And
what was implied in my question is the hypocrisy and shallowness of libertarian ideology. And when you get to an endpoint where you have these Yarvin-believing oligarchs, essentially billionaires, then and they have the unlimited power, and it's all about the individual. This is kind of the way that they naturally create a system. Like the tech right, Palantir, Thiel, and Armstrong, and all those folks, their vision of like this praxis. You've heard about this, right? They're privatized cities and states that they want to build. That's Musk's vision for America and what he's trying to create at this current moment, right? I know we're getting a bit afield of it, but before you go, the Barry Weiss part is something I'd love to ask you about, because she seems incredibly heavily subsidized, and came from the institution of the New York Times, where she tried to self-cancel basically and said that everyone at the Times was mean to her for being a conservative and begged to be fired, and then ended up resigning and using that to kind of catapult herself into that same trajectory as Taibbi and Glenn, and now she has her own university and things like that. Where does she fit in your book?
Can we say university?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
School. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that I do just want to touch on one thing that you had brought up, the praxis and the kind of corporate city state that Balaji Srinivasan is a big supporter of. Yeah. And Glenn has appeared at his network state conferences and had speaking fees there. So like this whole, all of this stuff is kind of connected. Like, you know,
interesting.
Once you're in, right? Like you're just making money hand over fist from these guys. Barry, she is, I mean, I don't go into her in as much detail, although she's certainly a part of the book, especially around the Twitter files. She was suggested for that to Musk by Andreessen. Andreessen's been one of her benefactors for quite a while. And yeah, he led a funding round of the Free Press last March or April, I think. I'm not 100% on the month there, but that valued the Free Press at $100 million. It raised them $15 million. So he has been a backer. It's rumored that Musk is a backer. I'm not sure if there's solid reporting on that, but there's certainly rumors about that. I wouldn't be surprised if Thiel has some money in there, Sachs. Like, you know, She is she is publishing a news room. Kind of losing the track there. Anyway, her newsroom is aimed at flattering and supporting the point of view of these tech oligarchs. And so it is unsurprising to me that she has their support. The Daniel Penny, the man who killed Jordan Neely in the subway and was found not guilty, just took a job with Andreessen Horowitz.
Yep.
Right? We found that out yesterday. How do we find that out? An exclusive scoop from the Free Press, right? Like how did they get that, right? Like it's like amazing journalism there. I think
that's an odd place for Daniel Perry to just go randomly apply to.
Yeah, almost like maybe they like reached out to him because they wanted to.
They admired his previous work.
Well, they definitely admired his previous work.
Did they hire him as a security guard, or what is it that they?
Yeah, I don't know. I think he's
driving the jitney, their little shuttle back from the parking lot. Well, let me ask you this before we go too, because I'm also sort of fascinated on the, where everybody landed, because I watched the Call-in sort of like a growth, and I don't know, is Call-in still exist?
No, Call-in does not exist anymore. I think there's only one place where you can find the podcast anymore. It has been folded into Rumble's Creator Suite.
Okay. Call-in was a sort of rival to YouTube and Rumble with some other features that were associated with it. And I know that they were handing out a lot of money, and they were handing it out to people on the right, and they were handing out to sort of like part of this sort of post-left in some instances. Some who are still arguably left as well that I was aware of, but like, a lot of post-left. Oh, were you one of the people that they also offered? I mean, it was interesting.
They gave me money, yeah.
There was interesting where all that money went to. Like they were trying to create some type of like, these are people who are silenced on the normal discourse or what. And I was just like, what's going on with this? There was a lot of money shoveled out to people. I don't know how much you got to that, but I heard some big numbers that I was like, wow, that's a lot of money for somebody to be spending.
Yeah, I mean, mine's in the book. They pay me $60,000 for a year, a little over $60,000 for a year.
And there were people who got, I think, significantly more than that.
Oh yeah, yeah. No. Of course, yeah. I mean, they gave Glenn a contract. They gave Matt a contract. Let's see who else. Who do I know? They had deals. They had deals with Sirota. They had a deal with Sirota. They had a deal with Abby Martin. They had a deal with Brianna Joy Gray
and
Hugh Anthony
Dorr.
Yeah, a number of people. I think I was in the second round of creators. Q got me in, and like I just kind of I highballed them, and from where they had pitched me, and they said yes. So at the time, I didn't really know who David Sachs was, but it was his money. Like that's whose money it was. And as I say in the book, like I'm not trying to say that like if I knew that David Sachs was behind the money and they were saying you can just have this money to just make a podcast and do whatever you want, I would have said no. I don't think I would have said no. I mean, but that's how this stuff works, right? Like,
right.
They offer you money and they don't want really any control, and they allow you to do whatever you want. But like, in order to continue to kind of access this money and this funding, I think there are certain implied expectations. Matt, in his book Hate Inc., and Jordan Ull brought this up on David Sirota's Lever podcast on Call-in, actually, where they interviewed Matt. Matt writes in Hate Inc. that something to the effect of, Department of Defense journalists that are leaked to by places like Department of Defense are not chosen because they have like an established agreement with the Department of Defense that they're going to say like, whatever they want. They're chosen because they know that they're going to say whatever they want, right? They know that they will do this. And Jordan brought this up to Matt. Matt did not appreciate his words being read back to him, but brought this up to Matt in context of the Twitter files. But I think this goes for all this stuff. Like if you're willing to play ball, I think that there are opportunities. Like we were saying, like the Network State Conference and Glenn, right? Being able to speak there, he gets to speak there because he's part of this whole little world. And so this is kind of like this network of influence, I think, that exists.
It's fascinating. Now, we have a guy, Gerard Depardieu, is that his name? What's the name of that real guy? Edward Gregorian.
You've said Gerard Depardieu so many times, I forget the real one.
It's Edward Gregorian.
Yes.
He has been a wonderful benefactor for the show. Just a guy from Belgium who really
likes wokeness.
Yeah.
That was a plus for us.
I'll show you. He's got a CV, so you know it's real. Well, this is fascinating stuff, and we'll put a link to Owned, how Tech Billionaires on the right bought the loudest voices on the left, and a link to your work at IT Brew as well. Eoin Higgins, really interesting, and appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.